Welcome back, DIYers. Time has finally came. We're ready to get some paint on this old pig. That's right, we're finally going to get this house painted. Now, for those of you that are tuning in for the first time in this house painting series, it's been quite a journey to get here. What started out as a relatively simple project of painting the house has turned into quite an ordeal. I mean, I started out with just some light sanding to scuff up the paint, to primer and paint it, which turned into, had to do even more sanding and repair above the front and back porch. I had to do some sanding, more sanding and repair on the fascia boards. And from then, we turned into having to fix the expansion joints and repair those. And we wound up replacing some of the old siding that was bad. I wound up replacing all of the corner trim, wound up replacing most of the window trim, and then finally we replaced the trim around the gable vent over the garage, just to get to this point. Now, for those of you that are watching this for the first time and are a little scared to do this project, or even frightened or terrified, stick around to the end, and I'm gonna give you some tips that hopefully get you over that fear and get you out there and paint your own house. Because after all, you'll save money and your house will look nicer and you'll increase the value of it. I hear people tell that it's 5 to 10% increase in value of your house just by painting the exterior of it. And you can do it. So stick around to the end and I'll give you some tips. Now, before we get started with painting, there's a few little odds and ends that got to get done first. And the first thing I have to do, as you can see, we've got to clean the house again. So I've got a little test area right here where you can see where it's clean, and then all around it's that green stuff. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take some soapy water with a little bleach in it, and I'm actually gonna hand scrub the house. And why? Because I'm wanting to scrub out all of that green mossy stuff that I can. I want that bleach to penetrate the pores and kill what we can't see. Then I'm gonna come back behind and hit it with the pressure washer to get any little bit that I've missed. And then once that dries, then we can get started on the last little bit of odds and ends we need to do before we can get primering. So please subscribe, hit the bell notification. Love to have you come along on my journeys. And let's get started. All right, I got the house all washed and cleaned and pressure washed. As you can see, I don't have any of that green mold or mildew on here like we did before. And so the next thing on the list is caulking. And I got quite a few little things to do there. And first one of those is caulking over the nail heads of the window trimmer replaced. So let me show you how I'm gonna do that, because I got a little different way I do it than what you might think. All right, the typical way you see people do it is on these nail heads is basically they take a little caulking, they squirt some over the head like this, and they just take their finger and wipe over it. See, I don't like that because now you got this stuff you got to clean up. Now, you wouldn't have to, but the problem is when you go to paint, this is a textured surface. It's going to show that there's no texture there when you paint it, and I don't like that. And the other thing is it doesn't fill up the cavity or the divot as completely as I like. Now, another way you could do it is you could do the same thing. You could put some caulking on here like this, take a putty knife and wipe over it. But again, you're going to get filled, but see, you've got all this around here that you've got to clean up. And some of you might think, well, that's not a big deal, and maybe it's not most of the time, but the thing is when you're doing it, you got to make sure you don't go into the area that you caulked. Well, as you see, I keep doing that. So let me show you how I do it, to where you get a perfect little caulk and just where you need it, and it fills it all the way up. So with the method I use, you can see I get perfect little caulking circles over just the nail heads only. Now, some of you may have seen some of the other videos in this house painting series know how I do that. But for those of you that haven't, let me show you how I get this nice, neat, perfect little circle over all the nail heads. So how I get those perfect caulking circles is, one, with a piece of scrap wood, some tape, a sample of the nail head, a punch, and a hammer. So what I have to do is figure out how big of a head there is on this nail. In this case, happens to be a 5/16. Next, I take this masking tape and I fold over one corner for a tab, and I just cut a bunch of them into about an inch, inch and a half long, and stack them on top of each other. And I usually stack them on top of each other till I get about 10 of them. Then I take that punch, put it over the center of the tape, hit it with the hammer, out comes the hole. As you can see, perfect holes in the center of all of those. So I've got all my tape squares punched out, and now I'm ready to put them over the nail heads themselves. So when you do that, you peel them off by the little tabs you've got and It's okay if you peel a whole bunch off at once because you got tabs on each one of them. So just take them by the tabs and be careful when you undo them because they can tear. Then you're just going to take and line the holes up over the nail head, just like that. Now, I tend to do a bunch of them at once so I can batch out a whole bunch of holes all together versus just do a couple caulk and go back. Now, we'll take the caulking and we'll fill the holes, and we don't worry if we overfill them. I'll use the excess to fill additional holes. Now, I take my putty knife and I smooth over the caulking. And I don't worry if I get some of the caulking outside the tape. I'll show you how I'm going to take care of that in a second. And if I don't have enough caulking in the hole, I just add some more. Now, any excess caulking that I have on my knife, I can use to fill additional holes. Then, by the little tabs, peel the tape off. Voila, you have perfect caulking circles. Now, this stuff out here to around the edges, not a problem. You always need a wet rag around. Just wipe it off like that. Nice thing is it's far enough away from where you're caulking that you don't run the risk of wiping your rag right through the caulking. And there you go, perfect caulking circles. All right, next thing I've got to do is I got to recaulk the tops of the windows. Now, that wasn't my original plan when I did the window trim replacement. I was just going to do these and be done. But if you remember back when I did that video, I put spray foam insulation along the sides and across the top to try and insulate the window a little bit. And when I did that, any holes or cracks in the caulking up here found that spray foam coming through it. So because of that, now I need to go back through, remove all that caulking, and then take and replace it with some fresh stuff. So the first thing I do is I take the square-ended putty knife and I go along the bottom of the window and free up any caulking that's on the window frame itself. And then in this particular window, there's not a lot. Then I go behind with my roofing knife blade and cut along the top of the window trim itself right at the wood to free it up. And then I'm trying to pull it out in one big chunk if I can. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And then I just kind of work through there, and I use my putty knife that's got the razor sharp edge to go along the top of the wood and get rid of all the caulking up there, because when I put new up there, I don't want any of that old on there, so this will get a good bond to it. As you can see, it is a little bit of work, but it needs to be done. So I finally got all the caulking out of this one, and I can tell you by looking in this window that that spray foam made it pretty much all the way across the whole window, because I can see spray foam about everywhere. So now I've got to go through and do the other 5 windows, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how we're going to caulk this all up. All right, got all the windows taken care of with the caulking out. As you can see, I went behind and taped off around where I'm going to put the caulking. Some areas there's a pretty good sized gap, and other areas there's not. So what I'm going to do is take this caulking and put a big bead along here, and take my finger and wipe it in to make sure I get that gap, a good coverage inside that gap. Then I'll come back behind with some more caulking and then take a putty knife and contour it across here so it looks nice and neat. And just about all the windows have this kind of a gapping to them. That's what I'm talking about right there. What I'll do is take a wetted putty knife and push that on in. And the reason is I don't want that up off the window like that, because I'm afraid water will get underneath it. Okay, finish all the other windows. We're getting one step closer to painting this pig. All right, the next little thing I have to do is I want to refill these butt joints, or expansion seams, if you will. In a previous video, I went through how I corrected these expansion joints when they were too narrow, and when I caulked them. And since then, the caulking has shrunk back, and it's kind of got a concave surface to it, and I'd like to see if I can't get it a little more full and flat with the surface. So what do I do when I'm prepping? Basically, I'm taking my putty knife that I got razor sharp, and I'm scraping the edge of the seam and getting the caulk off of the edge of the seam on each side. And then when I get that all taken care of and gotten off, then I take my utility knife and I score down along the end, just inside the edge of the siding, and then come back through and scrape again so that I get a little more of that out of there. The other thing I'm doing also is when I scrape, I'm scraping inside the concave part of it also to roughen up that caulking. All right, I got them all taped off. Now this go around, I taped a little wider than I did the first time. First time I did this, I had the tape just barely on the edge. This time I'm over the edge a little bit because I want that good overlap. And so basically I just take my caulking and put a bead down in there. I take my putty knife and I just smooth it out. And I make sure that I got good even coverage all the way across. I press kind of hard so that the caulking will get ripples in it, so that way when it's painted it'll kind of have a textured look like the siding does and not a smooth look. Now hang in there with me, just a couple more little things to do and we're ready to paint this pig. The last couple things that need caulking are any remaining nail heads on the siding and the screws on the bottom row of the siding. Using the same method I did for the window and corner trim, I just went around the whole house looking for any exposed nail heads on the siding. I placed the tape over it with the holes that are punched in it and filled them just like before. Also, I'm refilling all the screw heads that I originally caulked over back when I fixed the waviness to the bottom row of siding. And I'm doing it for the same reason I did the butt joints, because the caulking shrunk. And the last item that needs final caulking is the nail heads at all the butt joints that I repaired. All right, this is the last little detail that needs to be done before we get the paint on this pig. And that detail is putting Peel Bond primer on the bottom 4 foot of the siding. Before I did that, the first thing I had to do was I had to tape off the foundation by masking up under the bottom row of siding. I did it this way to make sure I didn't get any paint on the foundation. Now remember, it's in the details that make the difference between a DIY finish and a professional DIY finish. And we want to strive for the professional finish. Then using my masker, I masked off the foundation with 6-inch paper. Now, Peel Bond primer is not only good for keeping paint from peeling up when you're painting your house, but it also works good as a sealer, and that's what I'm using it for here. Back when I replaced the corner trim, I showed you how the back side of the trim had water damage about 4 foot up from the bottom. So because of that, I'm using the Peel Bond primer to prime the bottom edges of the last 6 rows of the siding. I'm also doing it to any window and corner trim that falls within that area, even though I've already Peel Bond primered and painted these. Again, it's in the details. Now, because I have an in-ground sprinkler system, I'm also Peel Bond primering the faces of the last 2 bottom boards. And the reason is because my sprinklers spray a lot of water on those boards and I don't want them to rot. That's why I had to replace the ones I did. Then lastly, I did a wide area of the primer around each hose bib to protect those boards also. All right, we're all set to get some paint on this pig. Now I didn't film masking everything off because, well, it's kind of boring and it took a while, but everything's masked off, taped off, covered, so I won't get any paint on stuff I don't want to. Now this first coat's going to be primer because I got a lot of bare wood exposure. So we'll primer this, we'll let that dry overnight, and then in the morning we'll paint the body of the house. Okay, we're ready to paint the primer here. So I got about 3.5 gallons in there because I've got 2 different types of primer. When I bought the primer the first time, it was quite a while ago, and now with the supply chain issues and everything, that particular primer they're out of, so I didn't know I'd have enough or not, so I had to go buy some additional primer that's different, and they don't recommend mixing them. So I'll see how far I get with 3.5 gallons. I put bug juice in the primer. This is supposed to help with preventing bugs from being around, and I've got a 515 tip on the Control Max here, and with primering I'm not worried about keeping a wet edge, so I'm going to start way on that side over there and come around this direction, whereas if I was painting actual paint, I would start here and go around and end on a corner so that it always kept a wet edge. So let me get everything put together here, get the rest of my suit on, and we'll get to painting. So as you can see here, I'm using my little giant ladder scaffolding system to paint the fascia here on the front of the house because, well, as you see, those bushes underneath there are in the way. Oh, and that green hose you see dragging behind me, it's called a whip hose. It's called that because it's much more flexible than the standard hose that comes with your sprayer. Now you're going to notice some start and stops here in my spraying, and the reason is my tip kept getting clogged with primer, and I'd have to turn it 180 degrees and spray and unclog the tip, and it's due to the primer being kind of thick. Now, before you even ask, I've already checked the sprayer, and it's on its highest setting, which is 5. As you can see here, I'm getting a good coat of primer on the house everywhere, and I mention that because you'll see why here in just a little bit. Oh, and that green hose I was using, you'll see that I'm not using it a little bit later. It started leaking and I just didn't want to mess with it, so I just took it off. Now that we're done with that little section, it's time to move the scaffolding over here in front of the garage. That way I can paint up above it. Now you see these areas where the paint's really white compared to the rest? That's where I put all that peel bond primer. You also notice on this side, I didn't use that scaffolding. It was getting late in the day. It's a little bit of work to move that stuff around, and frankly, I was just getting tired and I wanted to get it done. And by this time, the sprayer was working much better. I was having to stop very little to unclog the tip. Now as you watch me spray the soffit up here, you're going to notice that I'm definitely more than 12 inches away with the sprayer from the surface. And luckily, with the primer, it didn't make that big a difference. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but I wound up primering this side twice anyway. But it will make a huge difference, as you'll see when I go to paint the house. Oh, and all this cardboard, so I won't paint the grass all white. Now as I'm spraying this area here, you'll see the coverage isn't very good at all. In fact, it sucks. And the reason is I was running low on primer and I was frantically trying to get this side of the house done before I ran out. It didn't work. And that's where I ran low on primer. And you're gonna see me finagling and salvaging, trying to get every little bit of primer I got left so I can get this finished. Now I'm even a little more frantic as I spray, try and get this last little bit done before I run out. But I'm definitely out now. That's it. So, pack it up for the day, clean everything up. In the morning, I'll run and get some more primer. I'll finish this area I didn't get done. I'll also just reprime this whole side of the house because I didn't get very good coverage. And then next is getting actual colored paint on this house. And here we go. It's paint time. And it's about right here I start to panic. Things are not getting off to a very good start. Now you'll see me messing with the sprayer here, and I'm using my Control Max 1900 to try and get this sprayed. And the paint will go through the sprayer and the gun just fine with the tip out. It's when I put the tip in that I start having issues. And I'm using a 5/17 tip. That should be a plenty big enough tip for this paint to go through. And before anybody asks, I've already diluted the paint with water about 15%. They don't recommend you dilute it any more than 20% because it'll fade your color out. And you'll also see me turn the sprayer up to its max setting, which is 5. But every time I go to start spraying, it works for about one swipe and then the tip clogs. And I fart with turning the tip back and forth to get it unclogged. Try again, same thing. So no matter what I do, paint just won't go through this gun and tip. So it's time for plan B. Called my local rental store. They've got a sprayer for rent. I'm running down there real quick so I can get that sprayer and get started and get this done before it gets dark. It's getting to be early afternoon. Coming up on the local rental store now. Okay, got the sprayer loaded up. Run back home real quick. Get back to painting so we can get this done before it gets dark. Alrighty, I got the rental sprayer all set up and we're back in business. It's a Titan 540 and it came with a 5/17 tip. Now I didn't show it, but where I'd already sprayed with the Control Max, I had a bunch of runs. So I just took a paintbrush and I just brushed them out. Now my first impressions of this sprayer, man, this thing is sweet. And don't worry, I don't show it, but I do go back and I paint over everywhere I've already sprayed with the Control Max sprayer. Now you may notice I don't have the pressure setting on this rental sprayer just right yet. And you can tell because I got kind of a blotchy spray pattern. Also, you'll see me keep going back to the sprayer and turning the pressure up just a little bit at a time. Now some of you may be thinking just turn that pressure all the way up and go. Well, on this particular machine, that's 3,300 PSI, and you don't want to do that. And the reason is one, you'll wind up wasting a bunch of paint. Two, because my paint's thin, I'm going to have a whole lot more runs when I do it that way. And three, you get a lot more overspray. So it's well worth the time to get it adjusted and set right. Now it does take me a few trips to get it set right. But man, once I get this pressure setting on here right, this thing is wonderful to work with. I really like using this sprayer. Now it is a little tricky to paint around these utility boxes because they're so close together. It's hard to get good coverage down in there and not have a run. And on the far side where you can't see, there's a pipe that comes out of it, and the same thing. There's not a lot of room, and to try and get paint under it and around it without having any runs is a little hard. Now as we go along here, I'm going to point out the mistakes I'm making. I'm also going to point out the things I'm doing right. That way on your project, you'll know what to do. Now, here's the first mistake right out of the gate. I've already sprayed kind of the middle, I've sprayed the bottom. Now I'm going to the top. You want to start at the top and spray down. That way your overspray is falling as you're painting. Now what I'm doing here is I'm spraying way too fast. My hand's moving back and forth way too fast. It's causing me to have incomplete coverage. And later on, when I come back and inspect my work, I'll wind up seeing specks of primer poking through the paint. The reason I'm going so fast is because I've diluted the paint. I'm a little worried if I go very slow, I'm going to have a bunch of runs, and I definitely don't want that. And the other thing is, this is the first time I'm using this machine, and let me tell you, I'm just a little intimidated by it. I won't lie. Now here's something I'm doing right. You'll see me as I'm painting the corner and the window trim that I'm spraying from the bottom up. And the reason is so that I get good coverage of paint underneath that bottom edge of the siding where it meets the window trim or the corner trim. If I did it from the top down, I'd have more tendency to have incomplete coverage up underneath there. Now I'm standing on this work platform to spray above the windows, and I'm doing that so I get good complete coverage. Now what I'm doing here is I'm turning the gun over to spray the bottom edge of that bottom siding board. And I'm doing that in the hopes that I get a good heavy coat of paint on that bottom edge, without runs of course, and that maybe I get paint up behind there and I get paint on any wooden surfaces that are up behind that board so that they're well protected also. And I do this all the way around the house. Now here's a prime example of what not to do. And that's me inspecting my work like I know what I'm doing. What you don't want to do is just spray all willy-nilly in some randomized pattern. Because if you do that, you're going to wind up having a rough finish to your work when you're done. Now here's a fabulous example of what not to do. Look where my spray gun is in reference to the house as I'm painting. That gun is well over 12 inches away from the house. And in doing so, it's causing my spray pattern to be thinned out by the time it hits the house, in which case it's going to cause me to have incomplete coverage. And as I later find out, I'll have areas where the primer's showing through. The tips on these guns are maximized for a distance of 12 inches. 12 inches away is where you get your best performance as far as your spray pattern goes. I want to take a minute and explain to you why I'm going through and showing you all these mistakes that I'm making. Now, I didn't make these mistakes on purpose. I came by these mistakes honestly. This is the first time I'm ever painting a house, let alone painting it with a sprayer. Mistakes are going to be made. And I'd rather show you my mistakes so that when you do your house, you don't make them. I want you to learn from my mistakes. Now I know you've probably watched other DIY videos out there of people painting their house, and they'll show you painting the house, and then at the end they show you before and after and how great it looks. And they show you no mistakes. I guarantee you they made mistakes. They're just not putting them in there. I would rather show you the mistakes, learn from them, and we can all benefit. That way when you paint your house, you either A, have no mistakes, or way fewer mistakes than I did, and you still get a great looking job. Now on with the video. Now here's a good example of getting 50% overspray. I'll spray in one direction, and then when I come back, half my spray pattern will spray on what I already sprayed, and the other half will be new. And then when I come back to the next direction, same thing. And you want to do that so you get a good, even coverage. Now there's other things going on in this video as you're watching that I'm not doing right. But the thing I want you to concentrate on is, you can see as I spray, say to the right, you can see the spray pattern, and as I come back to the left, you can see the overlap, and that I get a good 50% overlap on the board that I just sprayed. And that's what you want to do. What I'm doing a beautiful job demonstrating here is as I paint the bottom 5 or 6 boards, I'm only bending over at the waist to paint it. Now I do try and keep the gun parallel to the face of the house, but what I find out later that bites me in the butt is that the bottom edge of like the last 4 or 5 boards, I get incomplete paint coverage. In fact, on the last bottom 2, I get areas where I got whole primer streaks where I got no paint on it at all. I want you to listen real carefully here. Hear the different sound that spray tip's making? That's the sound of the tip about to clog, right there. Now all you got to do is turn the tip 180 degrees, pull the trigger, blow the clog out, turn it back, and you're back in business. Here's another thing not to do. Don't continuously hold the trigger down as you spray. You're guaranteed to have runs there. You need to let go of the trigger as you finish. You need to press the trigger as you start. Now as I spray around this window, it was a little tricky because of how close the fence is to the window trim. But I got it done, and I also got it done without any runs, miraculously. Here is a huge don't do. Now you see I've painted half this side already, and now I'm painting the other half. Don't do this. You need to spray the whole side at once as you're doing it. What's going to happen is where I'm spraying the new paint, as it meets that part that I've already painted, that part of the paint's already dried or drying. And when I get all done, you're going to see a line right there where the new met the old, if you will. So when you paint, you want to continuously paint one whole side till it's done. That's what they call keeping a wet edge, because as you paint, the paint in front of you stays wet, and you just keep painting more and more over, and you keep a wet edge until you're done. So don't do what I did. I put this part in towards the end. What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? Did you catch it? What am I doing wrong? My gun's way too far away from the house. What am I doing right? I'm getting a good 50% overlap, actually a little more than 50% in some areas. Did you catch all that? Now we're coming to the end. All I got left is this gabled area over the garage. And in order to get that, I'm using my little giant scaffolding system. Now I could have done it with just a ladder. I could have climbed up the ladder, sprayed, come down, moved the ladder, sprayed, move, spray, move, spray. I didn't want to do that, pain in the butt. Instead, I set up this little giant scaffolding system so I could spray about 85% of that gabled area while on that scaffold. Now it is a little scary as you see me getting up on that scaffolding system, and that's why I keep one hand on the house as I walk and spray, so I don't wind up walking off or falling off of it as I do it. So it's getting to be late afternoon, sun's going down, and all I got left is this last little section right here over the garage, at least for the first time. Now that you've watched me make all those mistakes, let me show you how just a few minor tweaks to the way I was spraying fixes all of them. The runs, however, those took a little work. Now I won't lie, when I found these mistakes, I was pissed. I mean, I'd put a lot of time and effort into masking and taping off the house, spraying the house, going down to the rental store, let alone the expense of all the supplies I had to buy and the paint. And let's not forget about one little problem. I got a sprayer that won't spray this paint. So I formulated a little plan to fix all of this. For that little sprayer issue we had, I liked using that Titan 540 that I rented, so much so that I went out and bought a brand new Titan 440. Only this time, I'm going to use a 415 tip versus the 517 I used before. And other than the runs, the two biggest problems I had was incomplete coverage, which was 85% of the problems, and the wet to dry line I had on the side of the house where I was painting fresh paint onto the drying or already dried paint. And in case you're wondering, yes, I remasked and painted the whole house again. But this time, I didn't dilute the paint. Now, as you watch me paint this time, you should be able to notice I'm a little more relaxed as I'm doing it, and I'm painting at a slower pace this time around also. One of the fixes I came up with, stand on this work platform to paint the top of the house and over the windows. That way the gun can maintain parallel to the house as I'm spraying. And the absolute biggest and greatest tweak I made is how I held this gun. Now if you watch closely, you'll see as I'm painting the flat surface of the house, the gun's being parallel. But when I go to paint the bottom edge of the siding, you're gonna see me tilt the gun upward so it paints up underneath the bottom of that siding. All the while trying to maintain my 12-inch distance away and keeping a good 50% overlap. To solve painting the bottom 5 or 6 boards, you're gonna see me get on my knees to do that. And for the bottom 3 boards, you're gonna see me turn the gun over to spray that bottom edge and turn it back to spray the flat edge. All the while maintaining my 50% overlap and keeping a wet edge. Oh, and there's no willy-nilly or continuous spraying going on this time around. All right, so this part of the painting is done, and I have to say so myself, it came out really, really well. My new Titan 440 did an excellent job of painting this. I made sure I did a good job of keeping a consistent overlap so that I didn't have areas like I did before right in here and on the other side of the house where I didn't get the overlap very well and the primer showed through, and along the top where I had a lot of that primer show through. And for down low here where I didn't get up underneath this lip very well, I made sure and got that covered really well this time, even clear to the bottom down here, as you can see. The only part that I wish I'd got a little better coating on was right up underneath the very bottom of these. So there's a few spots like right in here where, even though I painted up under there really well, the cracks didn't get covered completely like I would like to have had it happen. I'd like to have had to where those got completely painted over and you couldn't see them like you have up here. But that's kind of a few and far between. But all in all, I'm very pleased with this. And as a DIY project that got done, I'm gonna have to give this an A+. And I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, this is just as good as if a professional painter would have come in and done it. Yes, I've got some areas where the paint got a little thick and it almost looked like it wanted to run. I had a few runs I had to take care of, and maybe that's where a professional painter wouldn't have had, but I've gone through and kind of repaired a bunch of those, and now to go find them, you're gonna have to look pretty hard for them. So I'm very pleased with how this came out. And this is a project that you can do. Don't be afraid of it. It can be done by you. You can do just as good a job as I did. So this video has gotten quite long to try to get to this point. So for the trim and the soffit, I'm gonna make that a second video because there's quite a bit of little detail that's gonna go into getting that ready to paint. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something. Hope it made it feel like you could go out and do it yourself. And until next time, happy DIYing.